Good afternoon and a warm welcome to our honourable guests, the honourable attendees joining us from all over Africa and beyond our borders as well on our virtual platform. I am Zanella Morrison, and today, through a series of panel discussions and fireside conversations with industry leaders, we'll examine how women have long been central to Africa's progress, yet systemic barriers such as power imbalances, deep-seated social norms and structural inequalities continue to limit their full participation in economic and political life. Despite numerous policies, gender disparities persist, slowing Africa's economic transformation. In partnership with ACET, the Africa Centre for Economic Transformation, we convene this online platform with high-level, solution-driven conversations with leaders in politics, in economics, and international development. This discussion will shift power dynamics, overcome systemic barriers, and define actionable policies to advance gender equality as a core pillar of Africa's transformation. These sessions are going to review key highlights of ACET's newest gender-focused report, the fourth African Transformation Report on Gender Equality, and the African Women's Inclusion Index, as well as the recommendations that come with a view of socializing the report and igniting policy conversations so we advance gender equality and inclusion in Africa. I'd love to encourage you to please use the chat function if you have any questions, and use social media platforms to engage and share your views and your opinions as we see on the right of our screen. To help us better understand this report as well, I want to welcome Dr. Theophiline Bosse-Duke, Senior Economist at ACET, with some key findings and recommendations that have come from the report. Take a look.
Hello and welcome. I'm Theophiline Bosse-Duke, an economist at ACET. Before we start, let me ask a question. Can gender equality drive Africa's economic transformation? It's a debate we've had for years. The truth? It's complicated. It depends on the level of economic transformation, gender equality, and how these two things interact. ACET's latest research, the African Transformation Report and the African Women's Inclusion Index, reveals that with deliberate action from governments and policymakers, gender equality and economic transformation can reinforce each other. When African countries take intentional action on gender equality, their economies grow stronger, more competitive, and more resilient. So today, let's explore why gender inclusion matters for economic transformation, the key findings from ACET's analysis, and most importantly, what we must do now. The good news is Africa has made progress. Between 2011 and 2022, the continent's average gender inclusion score, which measures 4 dimensions: law, leadership, financial inclusion, and economic inclusion, improved from 45.6 to 53.5 out of 100. But here's the challenge. At this pace, African women will wait for full economic and financial inclusion until 2093. Yes, 2093. That's 63 years after AU's African Women's Decade ends. Clearly, progress is too slow. But here's what the research tells us. Countries that take gender-inclusive policy action, like Rwanda and Mozambique, see faster economic progress. Closing the gender productivity gap in agriculture alone could increase Africa's output by 19%. Africa's innovation and export value rise when women participate equally in STEM, manufacturing, and trade. The takeaway: gender inclusion fuels transformation, but only if we are intentional about it. For years, we've talked about empowering women, but empowerment alone is not enough. The real game changer is shared power. Here's why this matters. Women's access to leadership remains low. Only 6 countries score above 80 out of 100 on women's leadership, while 25 remain below average. Legal progress doesn't always mean real change. Africa scores 72 out of 100 in law and legal rights, but weak enforcement means women still struggle with access to land, finance, and fair wages. The solution? Intentional policies that go beyond paper and translate into real opportunities. Some African countries are proving that change is possible. Gabon reformed its legal system, allowing women to own property and work without male approval. Kenya and South Africa expanded digital finance access, significantly increasing women's economic participation. Ethiopia and Cote d'Ivoire are investing in women's businesses and labor market reforms for women. When gender inclusion is a policy priority, economic transformation accelerates. So, where do we go from here? Asset research highlights 3 critical actions for policy makers, businesses, and leaders. First, we must integrate gender into economic policy. Every policy, whether it's trade, taxation, or investment, must explicitly address and be responsive to gender gaps. Second, we must invest in inclusive financial and economic systems. Women need equal access to credit, technology, and markets. Finally, we must redefine leadership to reflect shared power. Governments and businesses must enforce quotas, mentorship programs, and equal pay policies. Africa's future is not about choosing between gender equality and economic transformation. It's about making intentional choices to ensure both. Gender equality isn't only about fairness, and it isn't only for women. Societies and economies where power is shared benefit everyone: women, men, boys, and girls. The time for shared power is now.
Thank you, Dr. Theophiline Bosaduka, Senior Economist at Asset, for setting the tone for the rest of today's online event, highlighting some of the key elements we will touch back on and the complexity behind the implementation of policy and changes in financial system. But let's move swiftly along to the next agenda item, and I'd love to welcome to join us for this conversation the CEO of Asset, Mavis Owusi Gyamfi, for a high-level opening, a dialogue with Her Excellency, the Vice President of the Republic of Ghana, Jane Opoke Egyeman. This is the first female Vice President of Ghana and an inspiration to so many young girls in Ghana and across the continent. So welcome to both of you. Mavis, this is your conversation. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Saneli. Madam Vice President, Your Excellency, I can't stop saying Madam Vice President, as you know, and it makes me smile. Thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you. Thank you for taking time out of your very busy schedule.
Oh, no, this is very important too.
Thank you.
I need to pay attention to it. Yes.
Excellent. And I know gender is close to your heart. So let me start with my first question. You are Ghana's female vice president. We hope the first of many. As women that hail from Ghana, you and I, it was really heartbreaking to see where Ghana falls on the Asset African Women Inclusion Index. So although overall we scored 56.1 out of 100, we went down 2 points between 2017 and 2022. We do really well on the legal side. We got 74.6 out of 100. But when it actually comes to implementation of those legislation, we don't do as well. So for example, we only scored 34.4 on financial inclusion and women's participation economically. And rather sadly, we are regressing when it comes to female leaders in Ghana. So where do you think we are going wrong? You know, what are we not getting right in Ghana and in the rest of Africa so that we can ensure that we course correct and we start to see real representation? You know, at the moment, everybody is very excited because you've been elected. Everybody got excited because I was appointed head of Asset. Everybody gets excited every time a woman is appointed. What do we need to do right to make sure that appointment like ours is the norm in Africa and not the exception we celebrate?
Thank you so much for your question. I also wish that we get to a level where it doesn't matter who becomes a vice president. We've had them before. and nobody said they were male. Vice chancellors, we've had them. Surgeons, name them. So the reason that people are excited is because we are not the norm.
Yes.
Okay, so we need to establish that. So I also share with you that we need to get to a level where this is not strange. This is just so because it is so. That we go through the same path as everyone else. So it begs the question, if that is the case, why are we so invisible? The reasons are many, as you and I know. And you see, it is not just the culture that we like to blame. One of the things in time past I wasn't happy about was to attend so many conferences on women, on gender, and you leave very depressed. You leave as if there's nothing you can do. Because all we do is to focus on our challenges, to focus on the negativity, as if nobody ever did anything. Would we as a continent be here if women had done nothing? It was a male who said to educate, a male from my culture, an Akan culture, which is matrilineal. It was a male who said, if you educate a woman, you educate a nation. What made him say that? Well, you see, if we want to see what we have gone wrong, let me quote Achebe. He says we need to find out where the rain began to beat us. And I think the rain began to beat us when we abandoned our own ways of seeing, of analyzing, of understanding, and use metrics that have nothing to do with us. Okay? Assuming every time we kept our women in history who have achieved a lot, the young people don't even know. Okay? Our women in politics, our women in architecture, in medicine, what have women not done on this continent? Where are they? In what presentations do we even remember? So the question would be, so what went wrong? I had a chat with young people only yesterday. They were asking the same. I said, you know, we shouldn't talk about, oh, the Fourth Republic. Listen, we've been here for a long time. The struggle for independence, that's not our history only, even though these are significant milestones. How far have we traveled? You think if there were no women participation, slavery would have ended? At what point did we get here? Because of imposition, because we abandoned our own ways of seeing, because of all the copying in thought, in action, implementation. My sister, we've been at it forever. It's not going anywhere. Okay? It is not going anywhere. And it's not our culture. There's no perfect culture anywhere. All the countries we think have done well. And please, let's go easy on Africa. We know some countries are doing well. Whenever we generalize that the whole country, the whole continent is not going anywhere, it will not go anywhere. Where are the examples we can learn from? What are some countries doing that we think are good that we can replicate? How did they get there that others are not getting there? What has been our history? Our history, especially to do with education. And I started just a few examples. I don't know if you went to university here in this country. You never did. If you had, you'd have known that at my own University of Cape Coast, the smallest hall or residence was for the women. The same in Legon, Volta, the same in KNUST, Africa. So how did we progress there? You have to go back. Who brought this thing we call education? And for whom was it meant? Before then, listen, we have had no history of women sitting idle doing nothing. We don't have it. We haven't had the history of this. Every woman has been active. Were we dying of hunger when these people came here? Is that in their memoirs? Read the original memoirs and see what they saw about us. So what systems were put in place now to put us here that we are lost? We need to go back and study that history properly and remove those obstacles. It seeped into our language. And I blame religion and I blame education. These are the two pillars that have brought us here. What did they teach us? That women can't. Is it in our language? And even those who do research in our culture, do you know what they do? They'll go into the Proverbs and pick all the negative ones. I lie, as Ghanaians will ask. Pick all the negative ones and show that's the culture. You don't believe in yourself. You don't have any sense of worth. You don't have any sense of identity. You think even what is beautiful comes outside of yourself. How can you progress? So there's work we need to do. We have just passed the affirmative action. Passing the laws and the policies won't do it. We don't lack 30% of women in any profession in this country. Why are they not stepping forth? Why are they invisible? The reasons are many. You and I know some. Only this morning, I found some 2 hours. Sometimes when I find 1 hour, I go to my memoirs. And I've crafted my memoirs as a conversation with my mother, whose own dreams were shut down because at the time, a priest told her father, who was a fisherman, that, oh, if your daughter goes far and so on and so forth. And I said, Ma, those priests are still here. They are in our relationships. They are in our workplaces. That, we know why we don't step out. You groom somebody, you mentor somebody. Now the boyfriend is saying something different. Who is that boyfriend? Where is he going? Do you get it? You see life on our campuses. You have come here as a student and you've turned yourself into a chef. I fought with them on campus throughout my life, from being hall warden to being dean, whatever, to being vice chancellor. You see, we know what stops us. If in our culture, if it's the culture that stops women, we should have no women queen mothers who have their own way of participating in the judiciary of their constituents, or constituencies rather. How did we get here? We know. So we need to ask ourselves, though, where did the rain begin to beat us? No culture is perfect, as I said. Okay? So we need to do serious research into our own past and keep it in view for the young girls to see that, listen, we have not always been at the bottom. We've been up there before. But when people come with their religion about woman and Adam and a whole lot of things, it's not encouraging. And when the education system comes for the boys and not the girls, when in our own traditional way, boys and girls were educated. We say somebody has dropped out. She's learning with her mother in the market. Why did she drop out? She's learning. We call her dropout. How is she going to step out? Or step up for that matter? So you see, my sister, we have work to do.
Oh, Madam Vice President, I agree with you. And I love the fact that you are asking us to go back to history. As an Ashanti woman, I grew up in a house where I was told the power of Ya Santua. I was told the power of queen mothers. I was told the power of women. My grandmother, a market trader, is a real representation of the power of Ashanti women. So I agree with you that we must go back in history. We must look at what women did. And we must also look at what women are achieving now and ensure we are communicating it and celebrating it. But having said all of this, I still want to push you a bit. You still had to navigate the educational system that we have, the colonial education system. You still had to navigate it. You still had to go through the processes of perceptions that women are secondary to men. And yet, in spite of it all, you became our first vice chancellor. You became Minister of Education. You are now vice president. What challenges did you encounter and how did you overcome this? Just to give me and all the young ladies on this call a sense of how not to let what looks like hurdles stop you from realizing your ambition.
My fair lady, do you have the whole day?
No.
Do you have a whole week non-stop?
We'll have to follow it up later, but a brief one.
Listen, I don't even know where to begin because it's been an interesting journey.
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe my own childhood also plays a role. I grew up in a home where I didn't know there was something girls couldn't do or boys couldn't do. Okay. No, my mother, my parents, we all clean after ourselves.
Yeah.
And that's how I raised my own children. So nobody cleans after you. Okay. We were both sent to school, boys and girls. Nobody was left out because you were a boy or you were a girl. And I think what helped me also was that I went to a girls' school, a girls' boarding school, a girls' secondary school. So you couldn't tell me that girls can't do physics. I've seen them do physics. You see, you can't say girls don't do maths. I just thought, well, you are good in maths or you're interested in maths, but I never associated any gender with it because I didn't have any space to do that. Okay. So when later on I go to the ministry and the girls are not performing well in maths, I need to find out. And I go beyond the statistics. What is happening? How are you teaching this girl at this age with this kind of psychology? Shouldn't you be using a different method? What should you be doing? Okay. And so the first middle school I went to, I keep saying, I was in the primary school, I didn't even know whether I was a boy or a girl. So that didn't matter to me. I was just there. And so when it was the serious one, let me say, was when I went to the university. And I suppose I was so old then for anybody to tell me what I can do and what I cannot do.
Like that.
You see? So when you ask what were the challenges, yes, there'll be many challenges, even in the lecture theater. Because there were a few ladies in the class at the time, you know, when you want to make your voice heard, the boys will be shouting, "Did you bring me to the university? Do I owe you anything? So why should you stop me from making my point?" You know? So I think those were very helpful. The challenges will be many. Listen, look at all establishment. When we say a board of 5, one of which must be a woman, you see there's only one woman. There's never a case where 4 are women and 1 is male. See? It's all about the perceptions. It's all about our invisibility and the many challenges that stop us from moving forward. A lot of it has to do with our self-confidence. You know, that's a very big issue. And we need to face it. Who are we? As I said, that's what the history comes in. Who are the other women who've come before us? If today we are complaining about challenges, let us imagine the challenges that somebody like Mabel Dagdan faced when she became the first woman to run on her own merit and get into parliament. What do you think were her challenges? She got there. There are Nijages, and so the names are many. They all got there. And if today we have challenges, I can't imagine what challenges they have. I was applying for the vice chancellorship, and I think that was the first major one I got. You know, moving up the ladder at the university, I think in a way was easy for me in the sense that becoming a head of department, maybe I was the only one who qualified. So even though I was the only woman among them, you know, yes, so that was it. When I joined the faculty, I told that's the first fight I had with my head of department. And listen, saying we should have a departmental meeting at 4, that time is for my children. When you finish, now I was telling him that, listen, I don't have a wife. You have a wife. So when you finish the meeting, go and drink your beer and you get home. There's food for you. I have to go and cook for my family. Okay? So we have to change the time. I said, I can teach back to back from beginning to about 2:30. My day is done. That time onward is for my children, and there's no compromise on that. So you see, and a lot of the men, I don't think it's because they want to be mean or anything. They just hadn't thought about it. They just haven't thought about it. So instead of confronting them in an argument and a fight, sit down quietly and explain the situation to them. Most of them come around. Let me confess, some of my strongest support from my undergraduate days till today are male. Okay? So I don't see the males as my enemies. Okay? So I'm at the university. I've been there all my life. I've seen many things we could do differently. Most of the time, I happen to be the only woman on the board. Whatever I took to the position of vice chancellor and the successes we got, they were not new. I had said them ad nauseum, and nobody was minding me. So I applied because I thought, no, this position would give me the space to do the things I've been talking about. So there I was in competition with 5 males, including my pro-VC. Nobody gave me a chance. We are not ready for a woman. Really? Did we ever say we're ready for a man? Or nobody even thought we were worth asking that question?
Yeah.
Yeah. So as for the obstacles, they will come in many, many forms. You have to believe in what you are doing and go for it. And then also recognize that every choice has its benefits. It also has its downside. Okay? You decide to stand out, or others that you are standing out, they will react in all kinds of ways. Okay? Men and women. Okay? They will react in all kinds of ways. And don't think that one gender is coming to support you because you belong to that gender. I have found painfully at many levels that is not the case. Because you see, we are all down there. And I think it's a natural human reaction. So I don't blame it. We are all down there struggling. And now you are up there. There has to be something with you.
Of course.
So the name calling starts. It was a woman who said we will give her wrong information because she had joined the administrative staff. Can you imagine? So you see, you have to believe in what you want to do. And you know the downsides will come. The name calling, so many things. But then it depends on what you think is important. If they are not ready for a woman, nobody asks a woman if we are ready for men. So
I like
don't
that,
give
it. So, but we are.
Give it that.
Okay, I love that. I love the fact that we never asked if we were ready for men, but the men
Can you
still
imagine?
took. I agree. I would love to continue this conversation for
Forever,
a much
but
longer.
we don't have forever.
I have to
No
come.
problem.
I have to find the time, but I want to ask you one last question before I sign off, and which is, President Mahama speaks so highly of you as an equal partner on his leadership journey to reset Ghana. Now, this is something that has come up very strongly in our report, the importance of shared power between men and women. And one of the things that we found was that there isn't enough data to show the benefit of shared power. So is the issue a lack of data, or is it something else? And if so, how do we get?
Many things. It's not just like, what is data? Data is information, isn't it? It can be statistical, it can be qualitative, it can be quantitative. So it's never one thing. We've all come to become very fixated on the figures. But you see, so many things go on too that may not necessarily be captured in how many women here and how many men there. Those are the gaps we need to pay attention to. Why would he say that? I worked with him when he appointed me as the Minister for Education. And it came to me as a surprise because I was at UCC. I had finished my term as Vice Chancellor. I was heading elsewhere. So I was wondering why me? So it told me that maybe people are watching what you are doing when you don't know that they're watching you. I came to the ministry. I had a long conversation with him, and he pledged his support, and he never turned his back on me. All of us who believe, who think we are happy that we have a woman vice president in Ghana must thank Mahama. If he didn't have that courage, if he didn't step out, I don't know what obstacles he faced.
Yeah.
But also saying, yes, we need to thank him. Without him nominating me, I wouldn't be here. You get it?
I do. I do.
Maybe I make my positions very clear at the beginning, what I'm walking into. And I did that in education. So, not that I'm rigid or anything, but I just want you to understand. I'm here. I think you have paid me respect by bringing me here. I need your support in going forward. These are my ideas. Okay?
I hear you. I hear you. And if I may be cheeky and say, you have my support, big sister. Madam, you have my support. It has been such an incredible conversation. I feel like there are about, 800 people who are just sitting outside watching the two of us have a conversation as we have a cup of coffee. No, a cup of hot chocolate. We are Ghanaian, a cup of hot chocolate.
Coffee, we grow coffee, don't worry.
We grow coffee, that's true. We do grow coffee, so a cup of coffee too. But thank you so much for making time to talk to us. And I would like to say to all of our audiences, this is just the beginning of the conversation. Please stay in tune. We will stay in touch with Her Excellency because I know she has great ambitions for changing those numbers in Ghana and changing how we as women show up and ensuring that we don't keep asking, why are we here? But also acknowledge that nobody asked the men to be there. We just take our seat. Thank you very much, Madam Vice.
Thank you too. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Mavis, what an incredible conversation. I'm hoping that everybody watching, all 800 and odd people, was smiling as much as I am smiling. So I'd love to join you for that conversation. I'll be bringing Rooibos, and I'd love to say, even from South Africa, we honor you and we really appreciate the insights. I want the book and I want to be part of the next conversation. Madam Vice President of Ghana, Jane Opoku Egyeman, thank you so much. Mavis, the CEO, thank you for this incredible conversation. It's going to lead us straight into the next panel discussion, and the topic for it is Beyond Stereotypes, Shifting Power for Gender Equality. Now, this topic will explore some of the structural barriers we are seeing in unequal power dynamics, social norms that are discriminatory laws that really hinder women's inclusion and gender equality. We also want to examine some of the challenges that impact economic transformation, look at strategies, how women can overcome and drive meaningful change in the spaces that they are in. So to help me drive this conversation, I'd like to introduce you to the panelists. The first one is Her Excellency Monica Gyengos, the former First Lady of Namibia, and Emma Theophilus, Minister of ICT in Namibia. We then are also joined by Crystal Simeoni, the director of the AfriFirm Macroeconomics Collective, the NAWI Collective. Please look up their bios. So incredible, the journeys that they have walked and their accomplishments. But I want to start straight in and perhaps ask the very first question. And I want to ask the question into you, Her Excellency Monica, to look at maybe giving us the time to diagnose the problem a little bit, looking at barriers to power and inclusion. What are your thoughts around the key findings we see in the report and the perceptions that women aren't capable often to impact women's opportunities to lead? You've been such a vocal advocate for women's leadership, and you've broken those harmful stereotypes. What did it take to dismantle it, and what are some of the steps we can continue to take?
It takes a very thick skin, because it's not a stereotype, it's a mindset. So the mindset says that women shouldn't be here. And because the mindset says that, it creates all kinds of stereotypes to delegitimize your presence. So it's not one harmful stereotype, it's a harmful mindset that really objectifies women and questions your presence. So say, for instance, we talk about, let's include quotas. Then the discussion becomes about merit. But the merit discussions should be ubiquitous. It should be about male and gender being competent. Don't we all want a public sector where male and female participants are competent? And that's a way of delegitimizing your presence. Another way of delegitimizing the presence of women is really asking, how did she get here? Who did she sleep with? Who does her husband know? It's never about your merit in terms of how you got there on your own. It's what is the sneaky mechanism that you use. So it's really about dismantling these mindsets and also speaking to men about gender equality is an ask. It's an ask to share power. It's not an ask for you to be disempowered. And this sharing of power doesn't take anything away from you, it adds to you, because what it does, it creates a fair society. And fair societies de-risk future generations. Our children benefit from fair society. So gender equality really benefits both male and female.
And it's incredible the things you say speak to what the Vice President as well. When you ask that same question, you would not ask it to a male. You would not ask how a male got there, what they had to do to get there. They somehow got there, and it's adequate. So it's a reminder to double check the things that we think of. Now, we also have the backbone of policy that goes in tandem with cultural norms. Again, this was highlighted earlier on. Countries in the world where there's a large gap between those who hold power and the constituents they represent is problematic. So policies cannot be properly implemented if this gap is so huge. I want to perhaps move on to the next question around your experience as a young woman, Honorable Emma Theophilus, your experience as a young woman on those who hold power and what is their role to implement these policies effectively, and how have you paved the way for yourself, but what are you seeing now that you are there that still needs to be done to ensure that power is applied properly for the benefit of society?
Well, I think my journey to getting to the position I have now as a young woman in political leadership and holding a ministerial position started with a he for she, a man who had the courage to give opportunities to women in general, but more importantly, opportunities to young women. And me becoming a deputy minister was the confidence of one man, our late President Hagejik Inkob, who then actually took that leap of faith. Because I can tell you, he faced a lot of criticism for trusting an entire ministerial position to a 23-year-old young woman. But nonetheless, he took that decision and he stood by it. But before that, it requires a lot of activity in political spaces. It requires being policy adjacent and ensuring that one actually has some level of understanding how government works. But of course, yes, the gap is still big. We still have a large number of women not in political spaces, a large number of young people in general, let alone young women in political spaces. And many people are still trying to get used to the idea of a young woman under the age of 25 or 30 or even 35 heading a ministerial position or heading a political office. And you see it in the way people interact with you as a young leader. You see it in the way they address you, the type of nuanced jokes they make sometimes, all geared towards, their unfamiliarity with the notion of you being in that position. But I can say in Namibia, it has drastically changed. We are seeing more women in positions of power. We are seeing more young women in positions of power. However, there's still barriers of us holding that power because every other day you're being asked, when are you getting married? When are you having babies? But I've seen now, I have a younger male member of parliament who sits as a parliamentarian. Nobody's asking him when he's getting married. Nobody's asking him if he has children or when he's getting children. Nobody cares what he dresses on a Sunday or on a Wednesday morning. But somehow those questions always find themselves geared towards young women in politics. So there's really so much still to change. A paradigm shift still needs to happen. But finally now it is not uncommon. It's becoming a commonality that people have to get used to it.
Honorable Theophilus, I was going to do the dress code one. You know, if there were more women in these roles and in these positions, nobody would ask those questions. They would actually look odd, but they look okay. They sound okay because you are still a wonder in that environment. And hopefully we will get to a point where it is no longer a point of conversation. And what we've done is sort of set the groundwork from a political perspective to a broader dynamic. But ultimately as well, there's the economic aspect that policy has to start showing the fruits thereof. So I'd invite you, Ms. Simeone, to lean into economic power and policy failure, because we know that financial systems are the ones that ultimately we feel the most when they exclude women, and society feels them the most. You know, access to credit, wage gaps. So, and financial inclusion is scoring the lowest in the report. 25 out of 42 countries falling below the regional average. So, which one policy, in your view, we could fix that could have and help us to make the biggest leap to close the gap?
Thanks. So I'm going to complicate it a little bit and just start with saying it's extremely important to make sure we're using an intersectional approach to both understanding the problem as well as creating alternatives and solutions that can be used to rebalance current inequalities, but also make it just for all of us to live. And I'll give you an example. I don't usually work on land, but I just came back from the CSW in New York, and I was listening in on the presentation on Uganda and learned that only 13% of land title is in the hands of women. A little bit shocked at how low the figure was. So I looked up my own country, Kenya, and it sits at an unbelievable 1%. And I know through my own work that land is an important contributing factor to accessing credit, for example, because of collateral requirements by financial institutions. Yet, my community in the space of economic justice and feminist economic justice, I really hardly see any engagements with land justice movements. Yet, we know that these issues are so linked and so intertwined. So my point is the financial sector doesn't have the luxury of working alone. If we're looking at justice, it needs to work alongside other areas of intervention for real change to happen. And it needs to see life from different vantage points as well as pressure points. Which leads me to my final point. I know the kind of analysis and data that is collected and presented for policymakers usually doesn't really tell a complete picture, partly because of the roots of the technical analysis in the economic space, which is created to imagine that economics is ahistorical, is apolitical, and not gendered. Yet we know and we live through the knowledge that this is very, very far away from the truth. And the findings of this asset report show that really, really well. And so more data that is gendered, or not just gendered disaggregation of quantitative figures, but qualitative data and knowledge is equally important. So what narratives are we using to shape the future? What narratives are we using to question what is existing? Those really, really matter.
And when we apply all of that, we've got to look at quite a number of markers, and that's what the report is doing, is trying to look at various markers by which we are looking at the progress or the lack of progress of women. And I want to add one more to our conversation, I think, for all of us to think about and to look at it from different aspects. And I'll ask that question to you, Honourable Theophilus, looking at the digital space. There again, my biggest concern and my worry is we say leave no one behind, but when women are beginning on such a back foot, how do we begin to make a concerted effort to create lasting change that'll help women to have access to digital as fast, if not faster, so that we catch up? As only 37% of women at the moment in sub-Saharan Africa have, for example, a financial account, compared to 48% of women, largely due to barriers in mobile phone ownership, internet access, as well as digital literacy. So yes, let's look from an ICT policy perspective. What is the gap there? And perhaps you can share with us some strategies that can help to improve women's access to digital solutions.
Absolutely. I think ICT policies are essential. ICT policies that are costed, that have implementation plans, that have budgets for implementation. I think that's the most important. And these policies need to address the gaps related to access, affordability, and quality. Because one can have, access to fiber line crossing through their village, crossing through their home, but if they cannot afford it, and if it's not of quality, they're unable to acquire it and properly use it. So I think the first one is looking at how we can subsidize whether telcos by reducing the taxes of the devices that we have in our countries, making them more affordable, making data more affordable, and making sure it's qualitative so that women can access it easier. But also we can look at putting together a mechanism that many countries are now adopting, and the International Telecommunications Union is actually so much for, which is the Universal Service Access Fund. So this fund sits with the state, and its role is to ensure it rolls out infrastructure in the last mile where many of the telcos do not want to go to because it doesn't make financial sense, or making sure the fund subsidizes the taxes otherwise would have been charged on devices being imported into our countries. Because the reality of the matter is most of our countries are importing these devices. We don't produce them in our own countries, and therefore they come at a higher cost than at many parts of the world. But further, it doesn't matter then if somebody just has, what we call a dumb phone. We must encourage our citizens, and particularly women, to go online. Of course, making sure they know about the risks that come with going online and ensuring that there is some level of digital literacy, but ensuring that we reduce the cost of data in our countries to ensure that they're able to optimally use these online spaces, whether it's to transact, whether it's to advertise their businesses, whether it's to be connected to a support system in every phases of their lives. And all this starts with qualitative, accessible, and affordable ICT policies that are addressing these gaps.
And now when we take those policies, and I'm glad you make the example of telcos. I think we always look at telcos and we say they're responsible, they can do this, and we're structuring policies around telcos. But there's two other very important players, and I want to ask you, Ms. Simeoni, to lean in on this. There's government and then as well as financial institutions. In your view, what are some of the actions that they can take to ensure that women can gain real economic power by unlocking digital solutions?
So I think the digital world exists in a world that has deep inequalities that need to be fixed first before we layer on the digital solutions as an approach. And I think a good way to begin is to begin investing in public services and public sector workers. This would mean universal access to childcare, for example, universal access to elderly care, which rebases the burdens that are put on women to socially reproduce the current system. You can layer that with digital solutions to make sure that happens with an ease, but the fundamentals of it happening still have to happen before any of that happens. Centering public provisioning also is really, really important. The idea that the state is central to development and development of African countries, and not letting market forces or the private sector dictate what developmental trajectory your countries take. So for example, if, with the notion of the market forces having profit as the end result, if you have a mega highway as a mega infrastructure project versus a maternal care unit, most times investment will go into the mega highway rather than a maternal unit as a source of investment to get to a point of profit maximization. And so recentering the state in how we, provide for social services is really, really important. And lastly, expanding at the same time as enforcing the law around equal pay, around sexual harassment, and this includes digital and technology-assisted harassment, around property rights and inheritance, and how can use technology to make sure that that happens in a more just way. It's not enough to just have the law, but ensure the training of the law enforcement to ensure that the enforcement of these policies is really, really important. And so this means a budget allocation has to be made to ensure that happens.
I'd really love the audience to lean in on this. I think as you were speaking to it, it would be interesting to hear or have any questions coming from you watching. You've got a chat piece or a chat block on your computer. Please do engage with us and make sure that you are sharing with us some of your questions. I think what's also critical to the conversation is looking at it contextually to each of the countries we're coming from, and asking the question is in terms of what should government be doing and what should private sector be getting involved in. So please type up your questions and I'll come back to you shortly on that. The next question, I think I want Monica to really lean into. Monica, this is around leadership and economic empowerment. I think gender inequality is tied to wealth inequality. What economic reforms do you believe we can give women real power in Africa today, especially in terms of shifting the power dynamics and making sure that we are seeing lasting and impactful change when it comes to the power dynamics that we hold, so that we also as women drive the narrative ourselves?
So the first and obvious point is that representation matters. And I make this point because in two days' time, the armed forces in Namibia will be for the first time saluting a female commander-in-chief, first female president. And this is important because power at the very top matters. Because to do what my sister Crystal was talking about in terms of really looking at how the public purse behaves, it needs some big decisions. It needs some big ideas. And a big idea is to really look how we think about capital formation. On our continent, capital formation generally ends up in investment, ensuring that the wealthy become wealthier. And we must reimagine capital formation in a way that it becomes an enabler of an equitable economic framework. And there's many, many ways to do that. And I think my sister went through some of the ways in terms of prioritizing healthcare, in terms of prioritizing education, because that enables people who are in low-income populations to move into better income that enables them to build wealth. And the issues around income and wealth inequalities are very linked, but they are a little bit different. But let's think quickly about wealth accumulation and where state power for me can be utilized. And in any economy, in any country, the state procurement is one of the biggest drivers of economic development, what government spends its money on. But not just the what, also on the who. So if government would apply a policy to say that 30% of our procurement spend in any given sector has to be female-owned businesses, this can be consequential for wealth creation for female business owners. And obviously, I say this within the context that this is part of a broader attempt to de-risk female business entrepreneurship. Access to markets, integration into value chains, capacity building, whatever all of that is, doesn't become irrelevant to this point. But this point to me can be a quick, easy, low-hanging fruit that can be applied by any leader. And that's why I say representation matters, because this is a decision that requires political will, and it requires a leader who's willing to spend some political capital in ensuring that this leader is, that this kind of decision is implemented.
And again, I think we've seen that across so many countries from a policy perspective, and I'm hoping that so many other countries, can follow, and we can have that 30% as a minimum, because even reaching that 30% is often a challenge to reach it meaningfully. And I've got a question which I find so interesting, and I was thinking about it earlier on, even when I heard initially when the Vice President of Ghana was with us. I've got a question from Dunsi Stroshine. I hope I've said that properly. She asks, in what ways do Western narrative impact African women? Now, we can look at this very differently, but I thought of it in many of our countries, we've had Western influence that has negatively impacted, and many of the cultures within our. She spoke about culture. She also spoke about religion and the impact of that. And now we are left with a narrative of women who do not remember that we were actually in those roles, that we led and we did incredible things as part of our community. So how can we ensure that there's that global gender advocacy perhaps that comes in and starts to help us to shift the mind shift of what the West has done, but also for us to remember who we were? So a bit of a question rolled into two, and perhaps I can ask that to you, maybe Emma, how do you feel about taking the question for us to just have a look at the West, its influence, its impact, and what do we do now?
I think the biggest thing we can do is ensure we reclaim back the storylines around the contributions women have made in the modern world, on the African continent and before that. And we need to say their names and we need to tell their stories. And I say this because as we are reflecting on ushering in our first elected female head of state, we find ourselves talking about the contributions around the gender policies that have now culminated into us finally having a female head of state in the country, where we have a parliament that is 50% women. But before that, we had a liberation struggle where we had women in refugee camps on the front lines as diplomats, but many a times these stories are not told. So I think we need to reclaim back the storytelling of women that have literally changed the dynamics in our society, that have changed the trajectory and the destinies of our countries. And if we do not do that, we'll continue to speak about it in an abstract form without actually pinpointing who these women are, what their storylines were, and what those contributions were to shaping the gains that we now have in many parts of our continent.
I appreciate that answer so much. Retell the stories and keep on retelling them so we know what good looks like. Ms. Simeone, I'm going to throw to you for a quick wrap up on your part, and I want to pull on another question as well, is how do we amplify the lived experience and the difference between what we want to see and the current lived experience of women?
I think that's intertwined with a question that came from the audience. NAWI, the organization that I lead, is called NAWI, and NAWI is not an acronym. It's the name of the last known Dahomey Amazonian from current-day Benin. And so it's an ode to remembering the names of African women who history has invisibilized and erased. It's an ode to an anti-colonial struggle because they fought against the French. And so really it's up to us to continue to fight and to reclaim our memory. And as you know, as you were asking the question, and I'm sorry, I can go on about this for a long time because the work of NAWI is also to tell economic narratives that are Pan-African and that are feminist. My mother's Kenyan from a group called, an ethnic community called the Kikuyu, and they organized their societies around 5 values, which were honesty, generosity, justice, temperance, and courage. And I'm often questioning myself in terms of how do we build economies of care that center on some of those values, and how do we reclaim them for ourselves? How do we push back on the narratives that we've been told about ourselves, this Africa failure complex that Tandika Mukindawire spoke about and wrote about? How do we gain ourselves back? And I think that's something that we continuously need to be asking. It's Women's Month this month, and this is a question for us all as African sisters. And where do we find the hope for this to continue? The lived experiences are pushing back and resisting on what economic analysis in my sector of the world tells us it has to look like, read like, show up like. At NAWI, we make sure that we center beauty in the things that we do and in the publications that we produce. We center qualitative narratives and storytelling that will sometimes, or often many times, go beyond what quantitative data and metrics will tell. Our lives are not just numbers, but our lives are experiences, and we need to remember that. And these narratives, this qualitative data, is what we need to present to policymakers to remember that the real life reality of existence on this continent is complicated and complex. It happens all at once. I don't live SDG 3 today and SDG 5 tomorrow. They all happen to me at the same time. And so the response and solutions and alternatives need to be as complex. And life tells us that, tells us of this complexity. And it's also an act of reclamation for us to remember. I'll stop there.
And I thank you for, I think, the work that you do, but so beautifully helping us to remember what's most important, especially now during Women's Month. And may we internalize it. And and on the back of the internalizing, I pick up something that we mentioned earlier on, is that what is good does not come outside of us, but comes from within us. So His Excellency Ngos, I want to pose the final closing remark to you and ask you to reflect on self-belief in what is possible. How do we reignite within ourselves that belief?
I think by, I say this often. There's a quote by Audre Lorde that says, your silence doesn't protect you. And why it's important for particularly women in prominent positions to speak up for themselves is that it signals to other women that this is not okay. Something that has really surprised me in Women's Month is we've all been silently observing what's been happening in the Nigerian Senate between a senator and the Senate president. And none of us really want to wade into that. But one thing I can say is that how that situation makes us feel becomes important, because you don't want the essence of what the issue is, which is an allegation of sexual harassment, become dismissed and get distracted by all types of other procedural issues. So I think we must speak up on certain things. Women must speak up for themselves, because there's no prize, there's no benefit for a woman who speaks to this issue for herself. The benefit really is for other women. And the narrative that I'm starting to say to myself, as much as we fight for representation, I think we're fighting for future generations. And as women, we must also potentially understand that we will not necessarily bear the fruit of our fight. So when inclusion happens, when this window opens, we need to take the point that was made earlier, that women are a homogeneous group, or not a homogeneous group. We are different. And as these windows open, we must ensure it's intergenerational, that there's a mix of rural and urban, that there's a mix of everything, so that we have the value of diverse perspectives of different women, including women who stand up for themselves on topics that are not comfortable. And a topic that is very uncomfortable and costly for any woman is the issue of sexual harassment.
And you know, to close off, I think, the conversation, and as we were engaging early on and having discussions, what we hear today, for me, I find a lot of hope in the fact that we are fighting, that we are now having conversations that perhaps 10 years ago we did not have the platforms or the environments to have. We've made progress. We are making progress. And your views and opinions today and the contribution of the panel is really helping us to just encapsulate what kind of progress we've made and where we are at today and what the struggle is asking of us going forward. So I really want to thank my guests for joining me for this panel discussion and to draw just from them the solutions, the shifting of power for gender equality. And with that, we have to move swiftly along the agenda. We're going to welcome next Dr. Rania Al-Mashat, Minister of Planning and Economic Development, to join us. Again, I want to step one back and say thank you to my panel. Let's get ready to move on to the next conversation. Now, the fireside chat, as I was introducing, is Rania Al-Shamat, Minister of Planning, Economic Development and International Cooperation of Egypt. We're going to move on to her address and contribution to transforming women in Africa.
Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed panelists and guests, I'm delighted to join you today during the Month of Women to celebrate the achievements and contributions of women across various fields. This occasion not only renews our collective commitment to gender equality, but also reinforces its importance as a cornerstone of the global development agenda. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank Africa Center for Economic Transformation and CNBC Africa for this kind invitation and for convening us to discuss this critical topic, one that continues to gain relevance with every passing day. Gender equality is more than just social aspiration. It is a universal prerequisite for resilient economies and equitable societies. In emerging and developing economies, closing gender gap in labor force participation has the potential to increase GDP by impressive 23%, an opportunity that underscores the urgency of structural reforms. And according to the IMF, these reforms must focus on critical areas such as enhancing financial inclusion and regulating the informal sector. Despite the progress we have made, reality is stark. At the current rate, African women will not achieve full financial and economic inclusion until year 2093. This timeline is not merely a statistic, it is a rallying cry for immediate and concerted efforts. One of the most pressing barriers to women's economic empowerment is financial inclusion. Currently, the financial inclusion score for African women stands at only 42.7 out of 100. Alarmingly, 25 out of 42 countries fall below the regional average. This invitation severely restricts women's access to essential financial services such as credit, savings, and insurance, which are vital for their empowerment and economic independence. Financial inclusion is more than a means of economic empowerment. It is a catalyst for resilience and sustainable growth. By ensuring that women have access to affordable financial products like saving accounts, payments, credit cards, and insurance within a strong legal framework, we empower them to generate income, control their assets, participate in economic activities, and manage consumption, even with unforeseen expenses. This not only strengthens families and countries and communities, but also creates a ripple effect that fuels broader development. The government of Egypt, in cooperation with our partners, is steadfastly committed to translating our dedication to gender equality into tangible, quantifiable progress. Ladies and gentlemen, effective partnerships are true engines for change and growth. Through strategic collaborations with bilateral and multilateral partners, the Ministry of Planning, Economic Development and International Cooperation is currently spearheading the coordination of 89 gender-focused projects. Additionally, 82% of our official development assistance is dedicated to initiatives that prioritize gender equality as a core strategic objective. Let me note that these advancements would not have been possible without a strong political will and unwavering commitment to fostering inclusive and equitable societies. For example, Egypt's new Government Action Program 2024-2027 outlines 7 strategic objectives, one of which is dedicated to political, economic, and social empowerment of women, highlighting financial inclusion as a key priority. By accessing financial resources, women gain independence, invest in their families, and contribute to community development. This inclusion not only reduces gender inequality, but also drives sustainable development, strengthening economies and societies. In closing, together we can create a future where no woman is left behind, a future where every woman has the opportunity to rise and succeed, fueling progress for generations to come. Thank you, and I wish you a productive and successful event.
Thank you so much, Rania Al-Mashat, Minister of Planning and Economic Development and International Cooperation for Egypt, for those inspirational words. About 7 years ago, the mark was 100 years. Now we're sitting at 90 something, and I can tell you, I know that we are fighting for future generations, but I'd love to see that number become much smaller in my lifetime. So from one inspirational conversation and address to another, my following guest joins me in an intimate discussion focusing on women's roles in Africa's transformation. And this time we pull in SDGs and the UN and how they can help to advance gender equality in Africa. Please welcome with me Ahuna Aziakonwa, the Assistant Administrator and Regional Director for Africa at UNDP. Thank you so much for joining me. Now, you are the Assistant Secretary General at the United Nations at the helm of the UN Development Programs for Africa Department. And so your work really is at the heart of moving Sustainable Development Goals, especially for Africa's progress. What do you see as the impact that the goals have for African women stemming from the work that's done globally?
Thank you so much. It's nice to be here with you. Thanks to Asset and CNBC for really, I think, an important conversation. You know, one of the things I'm actually quite proud of working for the United Nations is that we were able to come up with a framework like the SDGs and the MDGs before that. And whatever we say about these frameworks, they have given shape and form to the fight for women to be empowered and to take their place in society. You know, starting with education. I don't know, some of you may remember the MDGs. It was all about girl education as well. And that became quite forceful within that framework, and it has paid off. Today, we can say that it's no longer strange to see or talk about girls in schools, whether it's primary or secondary or higher education. And the SDGs, you know, sort of advanced these goals also through the framework that was established then to emphasize quality, but also more sustainability around the development goals. And I think that I'm emphasizing education because really without it, it's going to be very difficult to see a future for women on the continent of Africa. We cannot give up on getting girls educated because it covers so many other areas. When we talk about child marriage, which actually kills the dreams for girls, it's partly because the education facilities are not there. Or when you talk about teenage pregnancy, another dream killer, you can avoid that by making education more accessible, more affordable to girls. So I think that the framework has served or continues to serve its purpose, and we have to continue to give the SDGs a push because we need that shape, we need that framework, we need a kind of a cabinet of conscience that really looks at the solidarity philosophy that Africa promotes in Ubuntu as the basis for any development programming that we engage in. I think also beyond education, financial inclusion, which some of the guests have been talking about, it's something that it's really been born out of this idea of sustainable development goals, making sure that women who dominate the informal sector, but also the business sector, the main economy, even though that's now called informal, are really the backbone of these economies. And without access to finance, but also financial inclusion overall, that allows them not only to be able to borrow to expand their business opportunities, but also to save for other needs, is something that we're seeing more and more with the advent of mobile devices, and an area of huge opportunity, again, to expand opportunity for women. And the third, I would say, is also what is being talked about on this platform, STEM. We're seeing more and more women, young women, being trained in the new technologies, in science, and the numbers are growing, which again is another equalizer. And maybe finally on this is the whole area around climate action. You actually find a lot of women in this area, particularly when we talk about energy and access to renewable energy, to clean cooking. Who is affected the most when it comes to cooking with fossil fuels or quite dangerous fumes that women inhale? It's the women, it's the young girl, but it's also the children. And so the efforts that are being made under the SDGs to promote renewable energy and clean cooking has been quite beneficial. We're not there yet, but it's a beginning that I think it's going to make a massive difference in unleashing the power of women to make their contribution fully to society.
And I agree with you very much around the SDG goals and the framework that they provide. You said very quickly that we need to keep on pushing and highlighting them because they're just so all-encompassing and comprehensive in terms of, but a lot of things can overtake and our attention moves on to, other things. So the question for me goes back into, as we saw the report was stating that we have to wait until 2093 for full economic and financial inclusion. Do you see elements, though, that can help us to speed up this progress? And I appreciate you mentioned STEM, you mentioned the mobile sector. What are your thoughts on what are some of the other things that maybe are happening organically that may help us to speed up? And what are some of the things that we perhaps need to, if we could focus on them, they would help to shorten that time frame?
No, I definitely think education is a big one. We still have far too many girls out of school, and that is, that's a non-starter in terms of speeding up and accelerating. We need to continue to insist on education and quality education for girls. The second is digitalization. If you're talking about acceleration, Africa has this enviable position of they call it leapfrogging, but we don't have to go through the strenuous pathways that other countries, advanced countries, went through to develop. We have shortcuts that can be taken because of the presence of digital means and new technologies. And I think early enough exposing young women to these innovations or innovative ways of engaging in their economies and in the challenges that they face on a daily basis is going to help definitely accelerate. But I also think we need to look at the political. And some of the other guests were speaking about this. We still have way too few women around the decision-making table. The more we can have the Emmas, the minister from Namibia, whether appointed or elected, around the table, because you can see, I've met her, young, but extremely competent, with character and with confidence. And you will feel safe with a woman of that caliber around a decision-making table that has to do with how the future of the country is shaped. And I think we've had way too many governments that have not taken into account the voice, the contribution that women have to make in navigating their future, and politically, I mean. And, recently I was quite happy to have launched under UNDP a program which we call a facility to support women political leaders, aspiring leaders as well on the continent. We really want to invest in this because it is an important part of the equation here, that we create conditions that enable young women, middle-aged, whatever age, to engage in the political life of their countries. Because whether we like it or not, on the continent of Africa, we don't as yet have a powerful private sector that drives economies. Everything is still happening 80-90% within governments. And so we need to get women into positions of governance because that's going to push the envelope a lot further than we have it currently.
And just to add on to that, in South Africa we do have a thriving corporate sector, but the challenge is exactly the same. We're less than 5%. We're less than 5% of those in power, especially as CEOs. Again, are women. So we, whatever happens across the continent, the need to start to seeing women sitting in those roles and being in policy and power decisions is so important. It's also, I think, part of a bigger question is the global. We live in a world where we have now to keep eye on the health of the entire globe and not just the continent. And I saw a quote on your LinkedIn page that says the Africa we want is the Africa the world needs. Can you unpack that for me? What is your thought around who Africa needs to be for the world?
Africa in the past has been just a place where, the rest of the world just went for the raw materials they needed to develop their own countries, or the human resource that they needed, whether in form of slavery or colonialism. And I think this needs to shift because that doesn't actually benefit the world, because what it does is it impoverishes Africa and Africa's future generations. And in such an integrated world, if we don't have prosperity on the African continent, it's very difficult to see a future, even for those advanced countries, which are now, let me just use one example, is demographics. The rest of the world is aging. I've just had a trip to Japan, and it is on top of their list in terms of challenges that they face as an advanced country. Where are the new consumers going to come from for the products that you're putting on the market? Where will the new labor force come from? Whether you're talking Europe or you're talking several parts of Asia where you do have aging populations today. where will the social services come from? So economically, the world needs Africa, but it doesn't need an Africa that's impoverished, that is not able to grow its middle class, because at the end of the day, it's the middle class that will sustain consumption, right? So look at the population demographics. This continent's population is going to double in no time. And half the world's young people are going to come from here. Therefore, the labor force that you're looking at, but also innovative and talented minds, agile minds, will be here on the African continent. So if the world does not invest in ways that develop that capital, then the world is going to suffer for it because it will be losing out. And this is really the message that we're putting out there. What is in the interest of Africa is also in the interest of the entire globe. So that's just on the economics and the demographics. But look at the climate as well. You know, this continent hosts the second lung of the world in the Congo Basin. If you talk about you know, the rest of the world being able to breathe in the next decades, Africa has something to do with that. And, you know, the lip service that is paid today, for instance, to climate action and climate financing when it comes to both adaptation and mitigation on the continent, it's suicidal, you know, because the world needs to come to support Africa to preserve for the world, you know, to conserve for the world. And African countries are ready to do that. If you look at UNDP works with countries to develop their nationally determined contributions, which is an action that's related to climate change. And in every single NDC, the ambition of African countries to make their own contribution to fighting climate change is out of this world. It is outstanding. But they're not being supported to be able to actually take these actions that benefit the world. So, you know, and then you look at areas, you know, things to do with trade as well. The Africa Continental Free Trade Area, the One Africa market. Now, this is the largest integrated market right now in the world, a 1.3 billion people market and growing. Now that is going to mean something to a world that is growing in its productivity and in technology, technological advancement. So what is good for Africa, it's actually extremely good for the world. And it's short-sighted to think that when you relate to Africa, it's only on the basis of charity. You know, this is a continent that is so miserable and needs our support. No, investment in Africa in a way that builds the continent means well for the world.
Thank you so much, Ahuna. I want to ask you a quick question because we have run out of time. And great having the conversation with you, but we also look at you as a leader and having these conversations and driving this agenda. What keeps you going? You know, what is it? What is the fire burning within you to keep going, to make a change and an impact for women across the continent?
I think focusing on the journey rather than the just destination. You know, often we get into these jobs and you sort of have your eyes on the next thing. That's never been me. I have deep convictions. I'm extremely passionate about a lot of things, and I focus on the passion. I'm not a careerist, and that makes actually my life a lot easier, and it makes me enjoy what I do because it's the journey that matters. It's the experience, the daily experience, the monthly experience, the interaction with people, the opportunity to develop someone else. It's really that's what keeps me going, and seeing people around me growing, particularly young women, being able to invest in them and see them do better than me. It is such a joy to be in a position where you can influence positively without necessarily it being about building something for yourself. You know, in the future. I've never really had to lobby for any position, and it's just really for me about following my passion, and that keeps the joy in the room.
And I think it resonates a lot, I think, with me and a lot of people, the authenticity of being your true self in that journey and trusting that all will fall into place. So I want to thank you so much. Please do lean in with your comments, any questions or reflections on our conversations. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you to my guest, Ahuna Eziakonwa, the Assistant Administrator and Regional Director for Africa at UNDP. Thank you for the conversation on women's role in transforming, especially the SDGs, and firming up their visibility and their continuous focus across the continent. Well, up next, we're going to take a look or play a conversation that focuses from the Africa Center for Economic Transformation about the ATR gender report itself.
Africa stands at a crossroads. A thriving, transformed economy is within reach, but one factor remains a game changer: gender equality. But how are they connected? And what can we do to ensure progress for all? The 2025 African Transformation Report explores these questions, offering insights, challenges, and solutions. Let's talk numbers. Research across 30 African countries reveals a clear trend. Nations with smaller gender gaps tend to have stronger economic progress and productivity. For example, Morocco and Rwanda improved gender equality and saw a jump in their economic transformation scores. Yet Ghana and Zambia improved gender equality but saw no significant economic transformation, proving that equality alone isn't enough. It must be paired with deliberate economic policies. The real barrier to women's economic participation isn't ability. It's social norms and institutional power structures. Women often face limited access to education, capital, and economic opportunities. But these are not just women's issues. They're economic roadblocks with staggering costs. Gender inequality costs Africa an estimated $95 billion annually in lost productivity and wages. Transforming these norms requires intentional, gender-responsive policies that promote shared power and participation. Change won't happen by chance. It requires bold, targeted policies to drive both gender equality and economic transformation. Policymakers must: 1. Align macroeconomic and gender policies. Integrate gender perspectives into economic planning for inclusive growth. 2. Tackle social and institutional barriers. Challenge norms and policies that hinder women's participation. 3. Expand women's access to resources. Closing gender gaps in land ownership, capital, and technology could boost agricultural output by up to 19%. 4th, address unpaid care work. Investing in childcare, maternity leave, and flexible work policies will enhance women's workforce participation. 5. Increase women's leadership. More female representation in government and business fosters policies that support long-term economic resilience. The message is clear. Gender equality isn't just about fairness. It's an economic necessity. When women thrive, economies grow, and entire societies benefit. The 2025 African Transformation Report provides the roadmap. Are we ready to take the next step?
Welcome back. And thank you so much for joining us. Please do share your thoughts, lean in on what you've heard, your perspectives. We'd love to hear from you. And I hope that this conversation, the panels, have all really made it worthwhile, you being here with us. Let's move on to our last panel for today. It's called Future Forward, Actionable Policies for Gender Equality and Economic Transformation. So we're going to be looking at policy-driven solutions to advance gender equality for Africa's economic transformation. Now, joining me for the conversation Malado Kaba, Managing Director, Falime Conseil, and Asset Board Member. Who's joining me later on is Elsie Ado Awadzi, and she is the former second Deputy Governor for the Bank of Ghana. So hold the space. She's going to join us a little bit later. But Mavis, I want to start with you. Welcome to this particular conversation. And she's the CEO of Asset. And my very first question leans into the summary we've just watched of the report, looking at policy, the policy gap and what's holding back gender inclusive transformation. What are your thoughts, I think, on that key question?
Thank you very much. And the report identified 4 key challenges, and I think a number of those challenges were inferred in earlier conversations. The first one is that our policies are not intentional enough. Gender equality policy must go hand in hand with economic transformation policies and vice versa. What we have found is that countries that close the gender gap experience stronger economic progress. But disparities across nations show that even countries that make progress on gender equity do not necessarily make progress on economic transformation. So our economic policies really need to be intentional in terms of looking at how you make them gender inclusive and over time gender transformative. And our gender policies cannot be these isolated policies that sit in a ministry somewhere and it's not mainstreamed into the rest of economic policies. So what we are finding, as you saw in Theophile's earlier presentation, is countries that have been intentional in combining both are actually doing better. And what what was really striking in the report was the countries that were transforming without gender equity were not resilient. So they made progress towards economic transformation, but as soon as there were local and global shocks, we started to see them regress. So you can transform without gender equity, but it will not be sustainable. The second thing is the resources are inadequate. We must invest in gender equality. This means investing in childcare, paid maternity leave, flexible work policies. We find that a lot of young women disappear from the labor force in their 30s because a lot of burden sits on them around the care economy at home for children, for elderly parents, etc. So whilst we are shifting the I don't want to say cultural perceptions, because Madam Vice President said it was not our culture. It's an inherited culture. So whilst we are shifting those perceptions, we should be putting in place systems that makes it possible for women to stay in work. And we need to invest intentionally in gender equity policies. Thirdly, we've heard a lot about this. There aren't enough women in decision-making spaces. We are on this panel, and today we've seen, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 amazing women on the panel, okay? Now, put each of these women in their spaces and you will see that they'll be looking at a sea of men. So there are not enough women in decision-making places, and we need women in those places sharing power and influencing how policies are formed. And finally, I referred to this earlier on when I spoke to Madam Vice President, we need data. As they say, what gets measured gets done. And if you look across the board, gender data is appalling. Even in Asset, when we were trying to do the women inclusion data set, we could only do 42 countries. And when we try to expand to even more data sets to have a more comprehensive overview of where there is real equity and shared power, it becomes harder and harder and harder to find the data you need. So those are the 4 challenges we are navigating.
And while you were speaking, two things came to mind. I don't think I envy the job that you have to do. At the same time, what an exciting job you have in your hands. Not worried about, I think, the fact that we do want to see change happening in the environment. But when we talk about changing the environment so women can thrive, Shoo, what a task we have ahead of us. But there are certain parts that we are getting right and we're doing a little bit better on. Honorable Malado Kabo, please lean in on this question for me, because where we are seeing something we can easily measure is on entrepreneurship, where women are very much involved in entrepreneurship. And yet less than 7% of total private equity and venture capital funding is going to them. What is the one financial policy that we can look at and look to change so that there's greater access for women entrepreneurs to shift economic power for them to grow their entrepreneurial clout?
Thank you very much for having me on this very important discussion. Yes, as you say, not enough actually is going to women entrepreneurs. And I think that it is when we see that they are not getting the much needed financing to grow their businesses, we are losing out on economic growth. We are losing out on job creation. We are also losing out on domestic resources that could be mobilized through taxes. I would maybe flip your question and ask, why is it that actually female fund managers on the continent why is it that they are not able to raise, as much capital as their male counterparts? Because we know that they are a vehicle to channel that financing to women entrepreneurs. And this is evidenced by the fact that, when we look at female partners in venture capital firms, they are twice as likely to invest in women entrepreneurs with a female team in the management, and 3 times more likely to invest in companies with female CEO. But actually, they are not. They are also facing challenges in raising the capital. Globally speaking, less than 1.3% of the $70 trillion in global financial asset under management is managed by women and people of color. And I was not even able to find, precise data on how much African female fund managers raised in the last couple of years, because the data is not really being properly tracked. So what am I saying here is that actually the gender bias that we see in capital allocation to female entrepreneurs is reinforced by gender bias in capital allocation to female fund managers. And I think that what we really need to do is to unpack what's happening when capital is being raised, but most importantly, who gets to make the decision to invest. And again, I think that alludes to what was said previously by my predecessors. It is a question of money. It is a question of power. Who gets the power to decide? And so to come to your question, I think policy changes, I believe that Africa has suffered too much from policy changes and back and forth. We know what works by now. And I think what we need to do is to keep steady on 4 things. Number 1, we need to support our female fund managers, especially when they decide to start their own fund. I spoke to many of them, and they say that it is difficult to actually raise the initial funding that would get us to the first close, which is important for them to kickstart building the track record that would establish their credibility, in the face of investors. Number 2, and we spoke lengthily about it, we need data, sex disaggregated data, qualitative data, quantitative data, to be able to track what is happening, and most importantly, to be able to come up with the tailored solutions and public policies and policy actions. Number three, we need to address the homophily, the gender bias that exists amongst investors, both men and women, actually. Again, I think there is also ample research on that, but female fund managers face harsher questions when they are in front of investors. Investors tend to be, less positive, more negative than when they face a male fund managers. And last but not least, representation. I keep telling my sisters, invade the boardroom space, sit in investment committees, and if you are not given a chair, take a folding chair. But this is very important, and there are positive initiatives on the continent. Let me just mention and commend the Boardroom Africa, which is led by an amazing woman called Marsha Ashong, which actually aims to support and equip women in their board journey. So let me conclude by saying that I think that particularly today, with the times that we are all experiencing and living, it is we cannot afford, it would be a huge opportunity cost to not significantly increase capital allocation to both women entrepreneurs and women investors. And this opportunity cost, is too high for us not to act decisively. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I want to lean in on what you've said, that we do need to find that data, and reports like this are important in their various forms so that we can show what is actually not being done. Because if it's still not found, it's not visible, it's harder to put pressure on those people in power to make different decisions. And a lot of things we're tired of talking about, like unconscious bias and all of that stuff. We need to see the change. Ms. Elsie Addo, thank you for joining me, Elsie Addo Awadzi. The challenge I want to pose to you, so we're having this conversation about raising of funds and the inclusion of women in the data. The challenge is 75% of employed women in Africa are concentrated in informal and low-wage work. So they carry perhaps a lot of the burden that can be perhaps unlocked by policy actions. And earlier on, our panelists spoke to government and financial regulators and the importance of just integrating women into the formal economy. What are your thoughts on this and how it just will help us to create upward mobility for women?
Thank you so much. And I particularly enjoyed all the remarks from my sisters before me. Let me say that this problem is actually critical, and not only from a financial inclusion standpoint, but also from the standpoint of effective policy making, as well as ensuring that once policy is designed, is actually well implemented to achieve the outcomes that we desire as a people. What needs to be done? And I'd like to look at this from the broad-based sort of policy coordination standpoint. Informality means that we have to look at education policy, we need to look at labor policy, we need to look at health sector policies, we need to look at legal related issues. We need to look at a range of other policies like trade and investment policies. I'm thinking, for example, how easy is it for anyone to start a business, to register a business, right? That woman in the market, how do we encourage, or that hairdresser, how do we encourage them to actually register their business in a way that's simple and pragmatic, right? That's also close enough to them, so they do not have to travel miles to go and register. Most of them have phones now. Is it possible to design an app that allows them to register that business on their phone, in the market, wherever they are? What about rules relating to taxation? How simple are these? Because these are precisely the reasons why they would rather play under the radar, right? And then when it comes to labor, we need labor laws to mandate very clear requirements for everyone being formalized. So whether I'm hiring a domestic helper or a driver or whatever, or a gardener, I need to put them on contract. And I know there are labor laws that say something like that, but I don't think the rules are clear enough. And I don't think that for those who want to actually comply with them, they even know what to do. Because they have to understand what it means for tax obligations, for social security obligations, and again, some simple form contracts templates, that help everybody get pulled into the loop. So these are all things that need to be worked on: trade policy, labor policies, educational policy, and etc. But then when you get into the space of financial regulation, what can we do? I particularly enjoyed the remarks of Her Excellency, the Vice President, about culture and history and who were we before we were told that we didn't match up to the rest of the world. Informality has been with us for a long time, but I remember, as Mavis had said earlier on, my grandmother, my great-grandmother, was very rich before anybody told her she was not included in the financial system, right? I grew up with with a matriarch in my family owning gold. I mean, 20, 22 karat, 24 karat pure gold and very expensive beads, and wax prints and kente cloth. And these were sources of wealth, nobody denied, until we decided that if you didn't have cash in the bank, or if you were not accessing the stock market, then you were not financially included. So my challenge for regulators and policymakers, financial regulators and policymakers, would be, how can we be more bespoke in the way we approach these matters, right? For our mothers and for us who own, non sort of physical, I wouldn't say non-physical, but non-conventional assets. How can we bring these into the fold, right? How can we get, providers of capital to respect these as assets? One of the things we had to do at the Bank of Ghana was to set up a collateral registry that allowed creditors to be able to register their collateral with us. And we realized that a lot of small business owners and women and etc. didn't have landed property, which most banks, for example, like to take as collateral. And so we created this collateral registry that registers both movable and immovable property to allow that market woman, for example, to bring her stash of fish as collateral for as long as she can find warehousing arrangements for it. She can bring her cloth. She can bring her beads, And so there are financial institutions that are beginning to understand that you can actually take some of those assets as collateral. But I think that policy should bring a perspective that is unique to Africa and to capture these already existing forms of wealth so that we're not pushing women out. A lot of other things that financial regulators can do. We at Bank of Ghana also started a sex-disaggregated data collection process from our financial institutions that we regulate. We were collecting data from them every month to say, tell us how many deposits you've collected, how many loans you've granted, and etc. But we were not doing that on a sex-segregated basis. So we couldn't tell. We're happy with the numbers, but we can tell how many men and how many women. If they're businesses, how many are owned by men and women. And by the way, by the youth as well, right? If you look at our youthful population, a lot of them are women, and a lot of them are not in the formal financial system, or if they are, it's not even evident to regulators and policymakers. So we rolled that out. But we talk about data a lot without talking about how difficult it is to capture that kind of data. And there's a lot of work that has to go into synchronizing the databases of the regulated financial system, as well as the regulators and policymakers, so that we can all capture the right kind of data that allow us more visibility on where the problems are.
Yeah. I think you've touched on so many points, and it's such a pity that our time is going to be up shortly. I did want to come in with, I think, an add-on to what you were saying from a finance and development of policy, and this was to Honorable Malado Kaba, to look at finance ministers. You've said in that probably one of the most powerful positions in a country, and we know that Assets Other Research is really putting in gender at the heart of economic policies. And I think my question is, how do finance ministers take conversations like the ones we've heard today and put them into economic equality and economic policies, not just from a cultural and a societal priority, but from an economic priority. What are those perceived trade-offs and downsides when we don't get that right?
So actually, it is very important to have finance ministers, budget ministers, and governors of central banks, fully embrace the need to actually include women and also ensure that they full and solid economic participation is also addressed. And there are actually actors that are ideally placed because they occupy a strategic position where they have a 360-degree view, as I like to mention it, over the economy at large. The second aspect for me, and I think it is particularly important in the context of this post-aid world that we're already seeing unfolding, players, such as finance ministers, governors of central banks, really need to understand that it is now or never to ensure that we close the gender gap on labor market and in the labor market and also in financial inclusion, because it will help us become more self-reliant. Increasing the economic participation of women can achieve that, as it can also achieve, the ambition of Africa to feed itself, because we know that women grow 70% of the food on the continent. Thirdly, it is also, I think, important to have these players fully understand the economic. I mean, they do understand the economic, of course, economic. Impact of empowering women. But I think we need to go beyond that, because ultimately what we want to see is what is the impact, how are we able to improve the lives of millions and billions of people. And by empowering women, we can do so because we know that they actually reinvest up to 90% of their income into the well-being of families, that is health, education, and nutrition. So yes, there are challenges, and I think we are going to repeat a bit what we said. Number one, representation. Not enough women in a field that remains largely dominated by men. I can really speak to that. Number two, data. We need to increase the availability of sex disaggregated data, even though there has been progress, but data paucity on the continent also drives risk misperception about continent and about women, as Deputy Governor said. And we need more granularity so that we are able to tell, whether public policies discriminate against women or really ensure that we cater for women's need as well as men's need. And I think most importantly, I will skip the leadership question, informality. For me, is another word for women. And as long as we fail to address it properly, and addressing it properly for me means let's depart from these very orthodox ways, of let's formalize it, let's tax them. I don't think it is that. I think it's really about also reconnecting to what we were before and acknowledging that we must think differently, that we must think, I would say, so as to really be context related. And I think that also listening to the needs of the people that are of the actors in the informal sector. I've tested, some experience when I was a finance minister back in the days in Guinea, where I opened public procurement to informal sector carpenters. And I was being risk, I would say, I took the risk. I didn't know what would be the outcome, but it paid off. And my intention was actually then to table I would say, a policy proposal in cabinet meeting to allocate 30 to 40% of public procurement to our local actors, but most importantly, targeting the informal sector. Because if you do that, you will help transform it, and you will also enhance a women's situation and also economically empower them. So I believe that, for me, the informality remains the biggest elephant in the room, and without addressing it properly, we will we will fall short of what we want to achieve for Africa's transformation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think there was just so much throughout the 2 hours, and I don't know. I think a full day would have helped us to really unpack so many elements that have come up today. But the conversation really looking at where the main levers are, especially those that are powered by policy, has been impactful. Mavis, you listed all the panelists that joined us today, and you said when they go back, they look at a sea of men. But I also believe where they come from are many women in the seat, wanting to be in the seat, driving to be our next panelists. Let's also not forget them. Let's pull them up. Let's be very conscious that it is no longer a game for every woman for themselves, but it's every woman for every woman and for the economy. But Mavis, please join me now and give us a final call to action for the event, for those who've joined us online. Your thoughts that sum up today's conversation.
Thank you very much, Zanelli, and thank you, CNBC, for being such an amazing partner, and to you for being an amazing moderator, Zanelli. So I take away from our conversation today 3 key things. The first one is, let's go back in history and let's remember a time when women did not need to be empowered because they had power. We had shared power. And let's go back to those moments and help the world, and Africa in particular, claim that shared power in everything that we do. And that starts from changing the narrative and helping our young ladies and our young men see that it's not just a handful of women that sit here, but many more women can be in this position. That's my first point. My second takeaway is, we can't overemphasize the importance of representation. It's not just about having a woman at the table. It's about having enough diverse women at the table to be able to inform policy and drive change. As everybody has said, we are not a homogeneous group. The 4 of us do not represent women across the continent, far from it. So we need a diverse group of women and a real representation at the table to ensure that our ambitions around economic transformation are realized, because 50% of Africa's population is truly at the table. And then my third takeaway is, there are so many great examples that are not going to scale. We heard it from all the panelists today. Great examples of initiatives. We need to really focus on trying to get these initiatives to scale. Let's identify them and let's work with the individuals who are driving these initiatives to really get it to scale so that we can really realize the ambition that we are looking for. Look, we have a choice. We can keep trying the same inclusive growth agenda that we've been trying for the last 25 years that is moving, but at a snail's pace, or we can start being transformative gender economists who are looking at how to transform our economics through real gender equality. And if we do that, we will shift power, we will share power, and we will truly improve lives on the African continent. I always like to end my discussions with an African proverb. So before I ask everybody to go to the Asset website and read our report, reach out to us and everything, I just want to give you one small Congolese proverb. It says, where a woman is respected, peace prevails. In our world today, we desperately need peace. So ladies and gentlemen, go to the Asset website, www.assetforafrica.org. Look at this report, reach out to us and tell us how we can work together to drive this agenda. Tell us the research areas that we need to do more on. Tell us the policy areas that we need to engage more on. We are open and we really want to partner so that we are not all sitting here in 10 years frustrated that the number has shifted from 2093 to 2000. 113 or whatever the saying might be. Let's work together to make the change a reality. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's really where we should end it off, on the back of Mavis Owusi Gyamfi, the President and CEO at Asset, for those inspirational words and for all who joined us and leaned in on the conversation. We want to say thank you so much. That's it for today's online webinar. I want to thank you all for attending and for joining us from Africa and beyond the African borders. Have a fantastic day further. Until next time, from myself, Zanella Morrison, and the team at CNBC Africa and Asset, of course, it's goodbye from us for now.